see the world that the rest of us live in. I'm paraphrasing and exaggerating slightly, but is there something to that? Is this whole discussion about the world order changing a transatlantic perspective or a European perspective more than a broader perspective?
I mean, the fact that the conversation is now finally at the forefront is certainly a reflection of a Eurocentric view for that order historically. I mean, obviously it came out of the crisis in Europe, the First World War and the Second World War is what gave us the United Nations, is what gave us the foundations of that world order. So fair enough that there was a certain Eurocentric or transatlantic focus. But that is, the reality is many of us have seen the breakdown of that rules-based order and the reality that might makes right being very much front and center well before the crisis. I very much actually heartened with all that's going on and all the suffering that's being caused by the multitude of wars that we are now dealing with, that actually the conversation is finally taking front and center, that the system isn't working, that it hasn't delivered. It's something that a lot of us have believed for well over a decade. And I think, you know, if 2014 wasn't, you know, enough of a wake-up call, that was unfortunate. But in any case, now, for the first time, I'm actually hearing, even among the great powers, even, you know, when you talk, obviously, you know, the US is leading on some of these things and trying to address these deficiencies. But even within Europe, where there was for a long time an attachment to symbolism rather than the realities on the ground. And, you know, you saw that even when, you know, we tried to address conflicts in various parts of the world where some of these ideals were kind of an obstacle to actually having real substantive discussions about what are the drivers of these conflicts and how do we try to mitigate those drivers so that those conflicts come to an end. So I'm, to some extent, actually more optimistic than I was last year, because we are actually having these conversations in a much more honest and transparent way, including among the friends in Europe who were, let's say, the most ardent, not adherents, but supporters of the old system and those that were least willing to admit that it was broken.
But do you think that, I mean, I take your point that perhaps in Europe we are recognizing a world that has existed for many before, but do you think it has become a world that is more might is right, more transactional, less focused on rules?
I think, yes, just because it's become more of a factor even among the biggest players. So it's, you know, historically, I would say if you look back at the last 2 decades, you will see that the people that are affected by this principle have been mainly in the third world, have been mainly in the developing world. Europe, especially, certainly the US, had the luxury of being at a remove and being able to kind of say, no, this is, you know, not impactful on us. I think obviously the war in Ukraine has brought that home more than anything. And that's why we're having this conversation. But it's always been the case. And it's all, I mean, I think if you look even in conflicts in our region, sometimes, you know, it was based on UN mandates, often not.
Minister Sanchez, you are the defense minister of a country that is in a region which I think has, I don't think any more doubt, has seen a very different approach from the United States, particularly in the last 12 months. The new national security strategy articulates it as the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which we now all call the Donroe Doctrine for short. But it is a very clear assertion of power in the United States' backyard. How do you feel about that? And what does it mean for your country and for your region?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to switch to Spanish in order to have more fluency in my words.
All right, folks, buckle up, because what you just watched at the Munich Security Conference wasn't just another polished diplomatic panel. That was a defining moment. That was the United States saying, the era of weakness is over. I just watched the Forbes breaking news clip of Ambassador Mike Waltz laying it out on the world stage. And let me tell you, this is a kind of clarity and backbone we have been missing for years. For decades, we've heard the same tired phrases: rules-based international order, multilateral consensus, shared responsibility. Sounds nice. Sounds polished. But what has it actually delivered? Endless wars, rogue regimes, terror groups emboldened, American taxpayers footing the bill for bloated bureaucracies flying business class around the globe while our own citizens struggle at home. And here comes Waltz saying what needed to be said. The old system isn't working. Now, let's be honest, that makes the global elites uncomfortable because they built their careers inside that old system. They thrived in it. They wrote strongly worded letters while cities burned and missiles flew. But here's the truth. Peace doesn't come from paperwork. It comes from strength. It comes from leadership. It comes from accountability.
The American continent didn't figure into this strategy. They spoke about Russia, China, the multipolar world. It was always focused elsewhere and not in the American continent. But then, last December, there was a new security strategy that was published, and the main focus was the American continent. And for us, this is a fantastic opportunity, because more people die in the United States due to drug-related problems than due to war. In fact, our country, which is battling this foe more than anyone else, more than 2,000 military and police personnel during the past 3.5 years were injured or lost their lives in the fight against drugs. And these are global matters, because drugs are a global problem, but it's also an economic problem. I've been to France and Spain and Qatar, and I've seen how that silent crime can reach those faraway countries. And there are people dying in those countries as well, due to problems related to violence. And when President Trump met with President Petro a week ago, we saw two fundamental elements. First of all, every single country in the world, no matter how powerful they may claim to be, is vulnerable to this worldwide scourge known as disinformation and misinformation. Global risk says that after interstate conflicts, misinformation and disinformation is the second greatest risk that we are facing. And in a few years, it might become the greatest risk that we will face due to accelerants such as AI, for example. Secondly, misinformation and disinformation reached President Donald Trump, and it made him believe that Colombia was doing nothing to fight against the drug trade. After that meeting, we were able to establish that 316 million people in the world consume drugs. And this makes it very difficult to do away with the drug trade as long as the demand is still there. And Colombia is the country that does the most to fight against the drug trade. And there is no better ally in the Western Hemisphere, and indeed in the world, in the fight against transnational organized crime. So, when we saw that the new strategy mentioned America First, President Petro took the cap that President Trump gave to him and added an S at the end. America's, because America doesn't just refer to the United States, it refers to the entire continent. And together we can do more than separately.
It is certainly true that your president managed to turn around what had been rather a tricky set of interactions when he came to the White House, because just in the weeks before, I believe, President Trump called your president a drug leader and a thug. So, hats off, you turned the rhetoric around, and you're right that in the area of drugs, it is important, you're doing something important, it's important that everyone focuses on it. But I wanted to stand back to ask you how you felt about a strategy which asserts US dominance in the Western Hemisphere as explicitly as this national security strategy does? Because that is a very big shift from the old order of the UN and rules. Ambassador, I can see you saying no. I'll come to you in just a second. Let me just ask the Minister. Do you think it is a big shift, or are you okay with the fact that the United States thinks that it can do what it likes in its backyard?
The President
of the United States doesn't meet with drug traffickers. The President of the United States meets with legitimate heads of state, and that's what happened during that meeting. But there was disinformation that said otherwise. So, President Trump was able to understand that what we've done attacks an economic problem. And this problem has to be dealt with not just with weapons, but also with economic tools. That is why we are trying to convince the rest of the world to purchase cacao instead of coca. When we look at what the United States has been doing, we have seen that every nation is autonomous and they can act for themselves. But the President of Colombia has also stated that there is a global order, that multilateralism exists, that there are organizations such as the United Nations or the Organization of American States to try and tackle these issues. And there is an opportunity there. And what we concluded after the meeting with the United States is similar to what we're saying now. In the case of Colombia, we see a problem that affects us directly, and the main issue is international organized crime. And this is why, alongside the United States, we want to strengthen our defense capacities to do away with this scourge, drug trafficking. That is the focus that our President is maintaining. But it's clear that the United Nations was created so that nations could work together to solve these types of issues. We are in a much more civilized world compared to previous centuries, and I believe that we can create a better world because we all live here. We don't have life on other planets.
Thank you. Ambassador Waltz, you've been very patient as you've been hearing my questions. Two questions for you. You are now ambassador to the United Nations, which is the institution, I would say, that epitomizes the old order most. And yet, your administration and your president is, as we heard from Chancellor Merz, we are in a new world now. And a world, I think, which is one where might is right, or at least power projection is playing a much bigger role, and where transactions play a bigger role than rules. How do you square that?
Well, happy to tackle that, and I have a gift for you along those lines. But first, I just wanted to point out what and reinforce what the general said. More Americans die from drugs and fentanyl and transnational crime than in any other type of conflict around the world. So this notion that the United States reasserting its leadership in the Western Hemisphere isn't necessarily new. I'd call it overdue. And Colombia and the United States worked quite well with each other under Plan Colombia in the 1990s, in the 2000s, defeated the FARC narco insurgents. Then we see the transnational gangs that have taken over Haiti, where the United States spent over $1 billion in 2024 to take on. We've now asserted a new UN mandated gang suppression force with a more offensive mandate, and we've seen Maduro, who was basically a state sponsor and state backer of narco-terrorism. He is now removed, and you know who is not wringing their hands? The 8 million Venezuelan refugees, a larger refugee crisis than Syria, mind you, that was destabilizing the region, and my former constituents in Congress, the Venezuelans who are seeking asylum in Florida, with tears of joy, thanking us. So asserting U.S. leadership has been welcomed, and we're hearing again and again behind the scenes, thank you, from a number of countries, 7 of whom will meet with the president in the coming weeks. To the broader point, look, the president has been clear, and my mandate is clear. We needed to put the UN on a diet. Everyone agrees that reform was needed. We are pushing hard for the UN to go back to basics, to that peacemaking and peacekeeping function that was core to its founding. And the biggest problem we've seen is that it's trying to do too much for everyone and be everything to every nation. So what has been a result of this initial push? The UN has agreed to its first budget cut in its history of 15%, just approved this last December. Nearly 3,000 headquarters bureaucrats will be cut. 18% overall personnel cut, 25% peacekeeping cut. We're going to get the UN back to fit to purpose. Again, despite the hand-wringing I hear in the media, what I was just in Geneva with a number of humanitarian agencies, and again, we heard, please keep up the sustained pressure. And I'll just say, you know, we've heard a lot about NATO and the future of multilateralisms and our engagement. Who here would argue that NATO is not in a better place now than it was 10 years ago when less than 7 of its contributors met the bare minimum? And with the president's leadership, we are going to reform the UN to get it fit for purpose and back to basics, much like we've done for NATO. He will do for the UN what he's done for NATO the last 10 years.
Is the president's goal, is the administration's goal to strengthen the UN so that it continues to be more effectively at the fulcrum of a global order? Or is it the goal to also create alternative institutions? I note that the president has created a board of peace, which has a very different membership, and
I have to wait, because that's a bit of inaccurate information. I won't call it misinformation. The United Nations, the United Nations Security Council created the board of peace unanimously, with countries such as Pakistan, countries, our friends in the UK, France, and others. So attached to that was the president's 20-point peace plan, which I saw many leaders who are here today show up at Sharm el-Sheikh in relief to sign, because we have the ceasefire in place, because hostages are being released. We now have humanitarian aid going in at levels that the entire world was demanding for, So is it going to work? I hope so, but I can tell you what wasn't working, either Hamas in charge or endless war. So the president has charted a third way, and to the point of the Board of Peace, it built on having our Gulf Arab friends, Muslim majority nations such as Turkey, Pakistan, Indonesia involved. And so to answer your question, what I'd call it is focused multilateralism. We've seen it through this institution that the United Nations blessed. We just saw it through the Critical Minerals Conference. We just saw the first direct flight between Azerbaijan and Armenia in its history, and the first wheat shipments flowing through those countries from Kazakhstan. So I guess I'll just stop with, I have to push back on the premise, the world on the brink, which I think was the name of this panel. We are returning the world from the brink, where it was 18 months ago between Ukraine, Gaza, Iran racing for a nuke, the Houthis shutting down the Suez Canal, the refugee crisis in South America, and on and on. So if you focus on the facts and the results, and if we have to reform multilateralism that hasn't been reformed, frankly, in 80 years, then I think that should be welcomed by the world. And in that, guise, I do have my...
Is that for me?
Make the UN Great Again, otherwise known as Munga hat. I brought one for everyone, but they've been so popular, I have one for you, Lanny. We could pass it.
There you go. Thank you. I think we'll give that to Kailash. Luckily, I don't have to respond to your accusations of misinformation because I have the absolute best person to answer this. Do you see the Board of Peace as a strengthening of the overall constellation of global organizations? And if so, why isn't Europe, actively pushing it? Let's start there, and then we'll go on.
Yes, it is true that the United Nations Security Council resolution foresaw a board of peace, but it also foresaw that it's limited in time until 2027. It's foresaw that Palestinians have a say, and it also was referring to Gaza, whereas the board of peace, as the charter is not referring to any of those. So I think, in the Security Council there is a resolution, but this board of peace does not reflect. And one thing, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, it is very good that you want to reform the international order. What is, I think, for the rest of us, majority of us, important that in the multilateral system there is equality of states. What Faisal was saying as well, if we reform, then we should actually take into account the world as it currently is, where all the states are equal, and also that nobody is above the law. That's why I'm talking about accountability, that if we have rules that we have agreed to, then, if somebody breaches, even the most powerful countries breach those laws, there's also, some kind of accountability and for these people, because, what we see in the world is that very often you have like one guy who decides to start the war against another. So he sends a lot of brothers, fathers, sons to kill other brothers, fathers and sons. And there's no accountability for that one decision that actually gets so many people killed. And I think, if we're talking about the reform of the multilateral system, and I agree that it's good that it's under fire, then that's why it's also on the front of these debates, but we should respect that all states are equal.
Sure. Here's just one thing I would ask everyone to consider. All states are absolutely equal within the UN Charter. The difference and why the United States is pushing for reform is the U.S. has historically paid more than 180 countries combined in terms of our dues, assessments, and voluntary giving. So, of course, when I have to look at mechanics, doctors, nurses, firemen that formerly in my district who are struggling to get their kids to school, but yet I have UN officials who are flying business class around the world, I can't believe that there is an argument against reform. But on the Board of Peace, look, I would just say this, for the people of Gaza, for Israel and the region, there's also a cost to status quo. Status quo was not working. The alternatives were Hamas in charge or Israel in endless conflict. And instead, we have charted a different way, backed by the countries of the region, and you have 8,000 troops that have now been contributed, publicly announced by Indonesia. You will see more in the coming weeks, and you have billions of dollars that, frankly, some countries were not comfortable putting completely through the UN system. So we have a funding mechanism that's now set up under this Board of Peace Charter, in addition to the Palestinian Technocratic Committee.
I'm conscious that we need to open to questions, but Ambassador, I want you to take the lens up a little bit, and you make a lot of very good points about the need to reform and the need to tighten belts, but at a big picture level.
But no one was doing it. We've talked about it endlessly, strongly worded letters, a lot of hand-wringing. No one was doing it, and when we're doing it,
Ambassador, I take your point, but if you listen to Chancellor Merz, the questions that we are all asking ourselves is the old system, at a big picture system of multilateral rules, engagement, alliances, is changing. And we are wondering what the United States, where it wants to go and what it wants to do. And is it a world of might is right, great power politics, unconstrained? Because, and this is the question to you, does the President believe in a multilateral system where there are rules that would constrain the United States or not?
NATO is stronger because of our leadership and push for the reforms that were badly needed, namely the contributions. The UN will be stronger at the end of this process. The status quo was unsustainable and not working in places like Gaza or Azerbaijan, Armenia. You have to ask yourself, why were we 18 months ago in so many active wars around the world. And I think it's a fair question for the president to say, why hasn't the UN been able to resolve issues like a border dispute between Cambodia and Thailand, or Azerbaijan, Armenia, or we could walk around the world, or Kashmir and India and Pakistan, where we faced a very serious nuclear escalation. So what I'm hearing outside of forums like this privately is, thank you for American leadership. America has to lead. If we have to have more focused plurilateral or focused multilateral organizations to do so, I think that should be perfectly acceptable if we're getting the results that results in peace and security.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think that was actually very clear. Questions? Lady here in the fourth row. If you could identify yourself and keep it very brief.
When Waltz talks about putting the UN on a diet, that's not reckless. That's responsible. Why should American mechanics, nurses, firefighters, hard-working people send their tax dollars to fund an international bureaucracy that can't even resolve basic conflicts? A 15% budget cut. Thousands of bureaucrats cut. Peacekeeping refocused. That's called reform. That's called stewardship. That's called putting America first without apologizing for it. And let's talk about NATO for a second. Remember when everyone panicked because President Trump demanded NATO countries actually pay their fair share? The media screamed. European leaders clutched their pearls. But what happened? NATO got stronger. More countries started meeting defense commitments. Suddenly, everyone remembered that freedom isn't free. That's not destroying alliances. That's saving them from decay. Now let's get into the Gaza discussion and this board of peace. The critics want to frame this as America bypassing the UN. That's not what's happening. The Security Council approved it. Regional players are involved. Muslim-majority nations are involved. Troops are being committed. Aid is flowing. Is it perfect? No. But here's the question nobody wants to answer. Was the status quo working? Was endless war working? Was Hamas in charge working? Was humanitarian chaos working? No. So when Waltz says we've charted a third way, that's leadership. That's saying we're not going to sit around waiting for another decade of diplomatic paralysis, while civilians suffer and extremists gain ground. And I love the moment when he pushed back on the idea that America shouldn't assert itself in the Western Hemisphere. For years we were told it was somehow imperialistic to secure our own backyard. Meanwhile, drug cartels flooded our streets with fentanyl. Transnational gangs destabilize entire countries. Millions cross borders illegally while Washington debated terminology. More Americans die from drugs than from many wars combined. That's not a regional issue. That's national security. So when the administration reasserts leadership in the Americas, that's not domination, that's responsibility. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The European voices on that panel kept circling back to one word. Equality. Equality of states. Accountability. Nobody above the law. And on paper, I agree. Absolutely. No nation should be above international law. But here's the reality check. Equality also means equal responsibility. You can't have 180 countries paying a fraction of what the United States pays into global institutions, and then act shocked when America demands reform. That's not equality, that's freeloading. If we're going to have multilateralism, it needs to be focused. It needs to produce results. It needs to protect peace and security, not expand into every fashionable global issue while failing at its core mission. That's what Waltz means by focused multilateralism. And honestly, that's the future. We are not returned some fantasy world where global bureaucracies magically solve conflicts through symbolic resolutions. We live in a world where China is expanding, Iran pushes toward nuclear capability, terror networks adapt, and disinformation spreads like wildfire. Power matters. Deterrence matters. Clarity matters. And the question the moderator kept asking, does America still believe in a multilateral system that constrains it? Here's my answer as a patriot. America believes in alliances and institutions at work. We believe in cooperation that produces peace. But we will not shackle ourselves to a broken system out of nostalgia. If reform strengthens a UN, good. If new structures produce peace faster, good. If America has to lead from the front to prevent chaos, even better. Because when America retreats, The vacuum isn't filled by peace. It's filled by regimes that don't share our values. Now, I know some people hear America first and immediately assume isolationism. That's not what this is. America first means America leads with its interests in mind. It means we negotiate from strength. It means we stop apologizing for existing. The world doesn't become more stable when America steps back. It becomes more unstable. We saw it. 18 months ago, the world was on the brink. Ukraine raging, Gaza exploding, Iran escalating. Shipping lanes threatened, refugee crises spiraling. Leadership isn't about speeches. It's about results. Ceasefires, hostage releases, security forces deployed, budget reforms passed, contributions increased. You can argue about the methods, but you can't deny movement. And that's what I saw in that panel. Movement, not hand-wringing, not moral grandstanding, not endless procedural debate. Movement. Now here's the bottom line. The old global order is being tested. That much is true, but that doesn't mean chaos has to win. It means reform has to happen. It means strength has to return. It means accountability has to apply to everyone, including powerful nations. And if the United States is going to be criticized for pushing institutions to actually function, so be it. Because I would rather have an America that leads boldly than one that funds dysfunction quietly. That's my take. Let me know what you think. Is this reform overdue? Is America right to push harder? Or are we risking too much change too fast? Drop your thoughts below. And if you believe strong American leadership still matters in this world, hit that like button and subscribe because these conversations are just getting started.